The United States is far and away the most indebted country in the world, and that debt is increasingly becoming a threat to American households, to businesses, and to the whole world that depends on the U.S. dollar for trade. As of mid-2023, the U.S. federal government had $32.6 trillion in debt. That's $98,200 for every man, woman, and child in America. The federal debt today is twice as large as it was just 10 years ago in 2013. It's 4 times as large as it was in 2006 and 10 times as large as it was in 1990. Think about this. The U.S. federal debt, which all taxpayers are on the hook for, has grown tenfold in just 3 decades. American politicians are addicted to debt spending, and the pace at which the government is borrowing is constantly accelerating. This year, Republicans in Congress attempted to stop the cycle of borrowing by refusing to raise the U.S.'s debt ceiling, which was set at $31.4 trillion. Eventually, the Republicans relented and came to an agreement with the Biden administration that prevented the shutdown of the U.S. government, and almost immediately after that, the country's debt rose by $1.2 trillion to its current level. But for all the Republicans' claims that they care about America's massive debt, it was a hypocritical move. Republicans have increased America's debt as much as Democrats. The tax cuts that Congress passed during the Trump administration in 2017 increased the federal debt by $1.2 trillion in 1 year. The expanded Medicare benefits passed under the administration of George W. Bush in 2003 resulted in an increase in the debt of $600 billion within a year. When it comes to debt spending, Republicans and Democrats are very much alike. Republicans might prefer tax cuts and Democrats might prefer increased social spending, but they're both perfectly willing to run the U.S. further and further into debt. But now a massive new problem is brewing. Interest rates have risen dramatically, and the interest payments on the U.S. debt have soared. This year, it's expected the U.S. government will spend $1 trillion on interest payments on its debt alone. That's 2/3 of the entire projected deficit for this year. 2/3 of the debt America will take on this year will go just to paying interest on its previous debt. In essence, the U.S. is borrowing money just to pay off its previous debts. Imagine a household or a corporation doing that, borrowing money just to pay off its previous borrowing. If people or a business did that, they would be considered insolvent. No one would lend them money. But governments are special. They print their own money. They can always cover their previous debts with freshly printed cash, so technically they never have to default on their debts. But there's a price to be paid for this. If you print more money, you cause inflation. And when inflation goes up, interest rates go up along with it. Central banks like the Federal Reserve will raise their lending rates in order to reduce inflation, and lenders in the bond market will demand higher interest rates on the money they lend in order to cover the cost of inflation. And that is what America is seeing today. This summer, the interest paid on U.S. government bonds hits its highest level in 16 years. But back then, the government had far less debt that it had to pay interest on. Massive money printing and deficit spending during the COVID pandemic led to inflation, which led to higher interest rates, which led to the massive $1 trillion cost of interest payments the government is forced to pay today. This cycle of borrowing can't go on forever. Even if the government is always able to print more money, eventually, lenders and consumers will lose faith in that money. If a U.S. dollar is just something that can be printed at any time, what is its actual value? In the markets, that loss of faith will come in the form of higher and higher inflation and higher interest rates. And then the government will be stuck in a doom loop. It will have to print more money to cover its rising interest payments, which will cause more inflation, which will cause interest rates to rise, which will mean even higher payments for the government and even more money printing, and so on until the system collapses. So can America get out of this debt doom loop before it's too late? What would the government have to do to get back to fiscal sanity? In this video, we'll explore the options the U.S. has to rein in its deficit spending, and if the United States of America can save itself from total collapse. There are 2 ways the government can get its debt under control: by raising taxes or by cutting spending. In America today, both options are very politically difficult, if not impossible. Let's look at rising taxes. When was the last time the U.S. saw significant tax hikes at the federal level? You'd have to go back to at least the 1970s, to the era before Reagan. Since then, significant tax hikes have simply not been doable. Powerful business lobby groups have established and funded influential think tanks in Washington, D.C. that put out report after report talking about the harm to the economy that tax hikes would do. Anytime someone in Congress proposes a tax hike or even closes a tax loophole, the army of lobbyists on K Street who are paid by big corporation goes into action. They pressure politicians into opposing the tax hike. Allow this tax hike to happen and we'll cut off our donations to your re-election campaign. Then we'll give that money to your opponent instead. That's a powerful powerful argument, and for decades, it has worked. And those think tanks and lobbyists aren't necessarily wrong. Tax hikes do harm the economy. If you raise taxes on households, you leave people with less money to spend. Less money means less consumption, which harms businesses. Sales and profits tank and businesses have to cut jobs. Then you have an unemployment problem. If you raise taxes, you leave less money for businesses to invest with. Outside of government hiring, business investment is the only thing that creates jobs. Reduce business investment and you reduce jobs. And once again, you have an unemployment problem. Not to mention the size of tax hikes needed to cover $98,000 of debt for every man, woman, and child would be enormous. Those tax hikes would impoverish people and businesses and leave the economy in ruins. So tax hikes are out. They're simply not going to happen. Now let's look at the other option, cutting spending. The U.S. federal government's largest expense is on healthcare. Medicare and Medicaid plus other programs together cost around $1.7 trillion per year. That's followed by Social Security at $1.2 trillion per year. Then there is income security, things like welfare, child care benefits, and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. These things cost around $866 billion per year. Defense spending comes in at around $766 billion per year. And now we have to add $1 trillion in spending on the interest on America's debt as well. Cutting back on the interest payments isn't an option. If the U.S. stopped making payments on its debts, it would cause total chaos in the global bond markets and would likely lead to a global financial crisis. So one of the other expenses will have to be cut. You could cut Medicare and Medicaid, the single largest expense, but those programs are extremely popular, even with Republican voters. Cutting off grandma's healthcare would be political suicide. No politician would dare to do it, even if some claim they want to do it. Same thing with Social Security. It's extremely popular, and the proof of that is the fact it has survived through numerous Republican administrations, like Reagan, Bush, and Trump, without ever being cut. That's because at the end of the day, even politicians who oppose big government spending programs aren't willing to pay the political price for cutting them back. So what about military spending? It's a well-known fact the U.S. spends an insane amount of money on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined. The U.S. could cut its defense spending in half and still have the largest defense budget in the world by far. But the defense budget goes to huge businesses like Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics. Through their lobbyists and allies on Capitol Hill, these corporations have established a system that guarantees their contracts will never be cut. Their influence is so absurdly powerful that even when the Pentagon tells Congress that it doesn't need a certain program or that it doesn't need that extra budget boost, Congress still approves the spending and forces the Pentagon to spend the money it was given. Defense contractors have developed clever and sneaky ways to make sure their taxpayer money never dries up. One thing they've done is to spread the jobs involved to almost every corner of America. Take, for instance, the construction of a fighter jet. Final assembly might take place at the Boeing plant in Seattle, but the wheels are manufactured at a subcontractor in Alabama, the windshield is made in a factory in New Mexico, the nuts and bolts that hold the plane together come from a plant in Ohio, and the software used to operate it is designed in California and tested in Boston. Cut a defense program and you cause job losses all over the country. Senators and congresspeople from virtually every state would oppose a cut like this in order to defend jobs in their home jurisdiction. You would never get the political support needed to cut defense spending. So now we've eliminated interest payments, healthcare, Social Security, and defense as possible areas where government spending could be cut. That's basically all of the largest spending programs the U.S. has. We're left with two more possibilities: eliminating waste in government and cutting back on government employees. Let's look at eliminating waste. Consulting firm McKinsey estimates that the U.S. government wastes $140 billion a year on improper payments. That means fraud, abuse, and overpayments, and the government only detects half of that wasted money. But to fix this, the government would have to significantly increase its information technology. For a complex system like the U.S. government, building an IT network capable of detecting fraud in every last payment the government makes would cost tens of billions. Not to mention it would have to hire an army of auditors and inspectors to look into every one of these payments. In other words, to save this $140 billion per year, you might have to spend $140 billion per year or more. It might actually be cheaper to just let the fraud and waste continue. Now, what about cutting government employees? In 2022, there were 2.87 million federal government employees, on which the government spent about $750 billion. Certainly that number can be reduced to cut spending. But hold on a sec. The largest number of federal employees, 70% of them, are in defense and security. That means soldiers in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. It means means airport security workers at the TSA and employees at the Department of Justice, in the FBI, and other law enforcement agencies. Americans don't actually want to see airport security eliminated. They don't want the government to reduce law enforcement, and we've already gone over why reducing defense spending is unlikely. So that leaves just 30% of the federal workforce that could be cut. These people work in health and human services, agriculture, the Treasury Department, and other smaller divisions of the U.S. government. The pickings here are slim. You could cut the number of jobs in these departments, but it would make little difference to the overall costs of the U.S. government. Taken together, it becomes increasingly apparent why no one has reined in the U.S.'s massive public debt. The things that can be done are too small to make a difference, and the things that are big enough to make a difference can't be touched. And so things will continue on the path they're on: bigger deficits, more money printing, more inflation. But eventually the system will start to break down. People won't have faith forever in a currency that's constantly being printed to cover old debts. Even today, we're seeing increasing numbers of countries moving away from using the US dollar for trade. We are seeing long-term interest rates rise to decade highs. Eventually, the US dollar will start to fall, and then the quality of life in the United States will start to really suffer. Maybe at that point, when the US has reached a true moment of crisis, the political environment will change, and it will become possible to rein in America's debt. If not, then the decline will continue right into bankruptcy. In fact, just several months ago, the US government faced a bankruptcy scare and was forced to raise the debt ceiling to prevent total collapse. To learn more about that, click on this video here. And if this video brought some value to you today, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.